Hello everyone, Recapped Mystery here. Welcome back. Today, I'm going to explain an American horror film called The Boy. Watch out and take care. Greta Evans, a woman, arrives to the United Kingdom after being hired as a wealthy family hired a babysitter. When she arrives, she immediately removes her shoes and looks around. Because the owner is away, the mansion is vacant. The arrival of a man named Malcolm surprises her. Malcolm is a regular delivery man in the neighborhood. Malcolm then invites Greta on a trip. Mrs. Heelshire, an older woman, arrives not long after. The house owner's wife, Mrs. Heelshire, inquires about Greta's shoes. Greta demonstrates where she had removed her shoes and is astonished that they are no longer there. Mrs. Heelshire says casually, "It's most likely her son's fault." Mrs. Heelshire then invites Greta to meet Mr. Heelshire, her husband. She also introduces her to the boy for whom she is meant to care. But, much to her surprise, this boy is actually a porcelain doll named Brahms. She chuckles, believing it to be a joke, but Mrs. Heelshire and Mr. Heelshire appear solemn. Mrs. Heelshire informs Greta that several nannies sought for the job, but Brahms rejected them because they are neither young nor beautiful. The Heelshires instruct Greta how to care for Brahms, providing her with a set of severe restrictions to adhere to. This includes reading loudly to Brahms and playing loud music for him, putting the leftovers in the fridge, setting a mousetrap, and kissing Brahms goodnight. Mrs. Heelshire informs Greta that Brahms is bashful and moves only when no one is looking. Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire then question Brahms about Greta. Greta is perplexed by what she observes. Mr. Heelshire seals the deal. For privacy, close the door. Soon after, Brahms likes Greta and wants her to babysit him. According to one of them, Greta phones her sister to share her experience in the residence. The next day, Greta overhears Mrs. Heelshire, who is furious because Brahms ransacked his chamber. Then Mr. Heelshire appears, announcing their departure for vacation. Greta and Brahms alone. Mr. Heelshire displays some of Greta's upcoming schedules. Greta begins to disregard the rules after they go, leaving Brahms alone. Greta wakes up in the middle of the night after hearing unusual noises. Investigate the source of that unusual sounds. While standing in front of a painting, lice bursting through a wall to choke her. It ends up being a nightmare. Greta then enters Brahms' room, and notices tears well up in his eyes. When the ceiling is examined, it is discovered to be leaking. Greta receives a phone call that night. No one speaks when she picks it up. Malcolm arrives in the morning to deliver. Greta inquires about Brahms while shopping for food. Malcolm informs her that Brahms was once a composer, Mr. and Mrs.'s only kid. He was a real boy, Heelshire, but then their house caught fire one day, and they were unable to escape in time. Brahms passed away. The doll is nothing more than a coping device for the family to deal with their loss. Malcolm then invites her on a date that night. Greta concurs. Greta prepares for the date. She was on the phone with her sister when Greta closes the door as she notices Brahms observing her. Greta goes on to take a shower. She is, however, surprised to see that her hair has been trimmed and that her clothing and jewelry have been altered, or absent. Greta runs to seek for it. Drawn to the attic by odd noises, she climbs the ladder, and the attic ladder closes on its own. Greta is trapped inside. Malcolm arrives to pick up Greta, and Greta yells for assistance, but Malcolm does not hear her. Instead, he departs. Greta then looks for another route out. Then, out of nowhere, a massive shadow forms in front of her face, scaring her, and she faints. Greta is unexpectedly let out as she wakes up in the morning. She explains this to Malcolm. What occurred yesterday night? The ladder, it turns out, can close and open on its own. Greta questions Malcolm about Brahms again, and he says there are two rumors about him. Some people in town feel sad for him because they remember him as a good youngster, but there are others who do not. Others contend that the boy was evil. Greta phones her sister again later that night. Her sister informs her that her aggressive ex-boyfriend, Cole, has been attempting to locate her. Greta despises Cole to the core. Greta miscarried as a result of Cole's beating. Greta then prepares for bed by brushing her teeth. She finishes brushing her teeth when she hears an odd noise coming from Brahms' chamber. She comes closer, and Brahms' room is seen to be incredibly dirty. With a lot of papers thrown about, she adjusted Brahms' slanted head, and the head moved on its own, but it was simply another nightmare. Greta returns to Brahms' room the next day to find him in a different position. He sits with her schedule next to him, as if he is commanding Greta to do what he says. Scheduled. Greta, who is stunned, rushes to her room and attempts to phone her sister. The phone abruptly rings. As Greta answers the phone, a child's voice tells her to follow the rules. A shadow appears beneath the door, and a child's voice can be heard. Greta is now understands that the doll carries considerably more secrets than she expected. The doll has come to life. Greta then opens the door to see a dish of sandwiches that Brahms has handed her. Greta is conflicted at the time. Brahms, it turns out, doesn't want to hurt her, he only wants her attention. She then phones Malcolm and informs him of the situation. Malcolm, on the other hand, does not take her seriously. Mrs. and Mr. Heelshire are later seen writing in a scene. "We cannot bear to live with what you have become," writes Brahms in a letter. "The girl is now yours." Mr. and Mrs. Heelshire load their coats with rocks after penning this letter, and then commit suicide. Greta, who has realized that Brahms is only the beginning, the soul of a small kid who wants to be cared for, begins to be good to him. Brahms and complete the tasks assigned to her. Malcolm returns the next day with a letter from Mrs. Heelshire and Mr. Heelshire. He also invites Greta on a walk that evening. Greta, on the other hand, feels responsible for Brahms and declines Malcolm's invitation. Malcolm, dissatisfied, departs. Greta is then taken aback by Brahms, who can move himself. The next day, Greta summons Malcolm to demonstrate that Brahms is still alive. She initially fails to demonstrate it because the doll only moves when no one is looking, so she abandons the doll, and it moves. Malcolm eventually believes her. Malcolm spends the night with Greta. The two are spending time together. However, their activity is halted by Brahms, who may be jealous. The two of them then had a talk in the kitchen. Malcolm realizes Greta is becoming attached to him and warns her by revealing a more full account of Brahms' death. According to what he recalls, as a child, Brahms used to play with another young girl named Emily Cribs. On the 8th birthday of Brahms, Emily went to the concert with Brahms. He never returned to the Heelshire home. Her body was recovered in the woods later. Her skull had been crushed. When cops came at this day to question the young kid, it was already on fire, and Brahms was subsequently discovered dead. Malcolm deduces from this that Brahms' spirit, which rests in the doll, could possibly evil. Greta's aggressive ex-boyfriend, Cole, arrives at the estate in the morning, planning to assault her. Greta must be returned home. Malcolm remains nearby for Greta's protection. Greta inquires late at night the doll for assistance. Cole awakens to find a letter scribbled in blood instructing him to go. He becomes enraged, believing it was done by Greta or Malcolm. Recognizing that it was Brahms who did it, she attempts to explain it to him by using rat blood, but he refuses to believe her. Malcolm eventually joins them and tries to persuade Cole that there's a lot more to the doll than meets the eye. Cole loses his cool and smashes the toy to bits. The lights in the house begin to flicker at this point. The home begins to tremble, and they begin to hear noises coming from behind the walls. Cole attempts to locate the source of the noise. The mirror then suddenly explodes. Cole lags behind. A figure emerges from a hole behind it. It turns out to be the real, now adult Brahms donning the doll's porcelain mask. Brahms defeats and kills Cole. Malcolm and Greta are terrified and flee for safety. Greta and Malcolm come across Brahms' room. They discover a doll constructed from Greta's missing garment there. Brahms' bed is adorned with hair and jewelry. Brahms had been watching Greta from that room all along time. Greta also discovers the Heelshire's departure letter, which reveals their plot of abandoning Greta as a maid for Brahms. Then Brahms locates them. Malcolm is knocked out by Brahms, threatening to kill him if Greta does not leave. Greta is able to flee the house, but returns to help Malcolm. Armed with a screwdriver, she cites the rules and puts Brahms to bed. He requests a good night kiss as he attempts to kiss her. She stabs him. Brahms tries to choke her, but she pulls the sword deeper into her throat, causing him to collapse. Greta saves Malcolm, and they flee the house. Brahms can be seen reassembling bits of the doll in the film's final scene, implying that he is most likely still alive. All of this suggests that Brahms never died in the first place. Please subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. To assist the channel, turn on notification and leave a like. Thank you for taking the time to watch. See you again soon.